Welcome back. There is a particular kind of revenge that never raises its voice, never sends a threatening text, never makes a single phone call that could be traced back to anger. This story is about that kind. The protagonist did not chase anyone. She simply remembered what she built, who she had been before the betrayal, and then she used every regulation, every clause, every inspection report as a scalpel. The brilliance is not in what she did. It is in what she already knew. Welcome to Eternal Diary. The smell hit her first. That was always how it worked with Mara Chen. Before sight, before sound, before she could even process what her eyes were relaying to her brain, her nose cataloged the world in a language that most people never bothered to learn. She had trained it that way, deliberately, over the course of 3 years working as a field consultant for the city's food safety division before she ever touched a spatula in a professional kitchen. She knew the difference between the clean antiseptic sting of properly diluted quaternary ammonium solution and the watered-down too cheap imposter that left a faint sticky film on stainless steel surfaces. She knew the damp wool smell of a walk-in cooler running 2 degrees warmer than it should be. She knew the particular acrid sweetness of fryer oil that had gone one service too long without being changed, the way it coated the back of your throat and sat there like a warning. Standing on the sidewalk across from the copper kettle on a Tuesday evening in late October, Mara Chen breathed in through her nose, and within 4 seconds, she had cataloged 3 violations that she was certain were happening inside the building she used to own. She did not smile. She did not reach for her phone. She stood with both hands in the pockets of a coat that cost less than the aprons she used to order for her staff, and she watched the light through the front window the way you watch weather moving in from the west. Calm, clinical. How completely detached from the part of herself that had once loved that building with something close to religious devotion. It had taken 8 months to get to this place. 8 months since the signing, 7 months since she had moved out of the apartment above the original Copper Kettle location, the one on Raleigh Street, the one with the drafty window in the second bedroom, and the radiator that knocked like it had something to say. 8 months since her mother had sat across from her at the kitchen table in the family home on Prescott Avenue with a notarized document and a ballpoint pen and the expression of someone offering a reasonable compromise instead of delivering a sentence. Mara remembered the smell of that kitchen too. Her mother's kitchen always carried something floral and suffocating. Oh, a plug-in air freshener near the refrigerator that had been there for so long, nobody in the family could remember buying it. Lavender and something synthetic underneath it. The chemical cousin of lavender. Mara had associated that smell with obligation since she was 7 years old, with being told what was expected of her, with conversations that were not conversations, but verdicts delivered in soft voices. "It's temporary," her mother Diane had said. 6 months, maybe 8, while we work through the estate situation with your father's creditors. The accountant says it's the cleanest way to protect the business assets during the filing period. You sign it over to the family trust, the trust manages the operations temporarily, and then when everything is resolved, you sign it back. You still run it. Oh, nothing changes. Her sister Vivian had been there too, sitting at the corner of the table with her phone face down and her hands folded in a performance of patience that Mara had recognized even then as rehearsed. Vivian was 3 years younger, had never worked a full shift in a kitchen, had never written a sourcing contract with a produce supplier, had never sat across from a bank manager at 6 in the morning trying to refinance a commercial property during a slow quarter. Vivian had shown up to the Copper Kettle's opening night in a dress that cost what Mara paid a line cook for a month, and had called the food surprisingly good with the sincerity of someone who had expected nothing. What Mara had not known in that lavender kitchen, sitting across from her mother with the pen in her hand, was that the accountant her mother had referenced was not a neutral party. He was a man named Gerald Foss, who had been handling the Chen family finances for 11 years and who had, Mara would later discover through a process that took 6 months, and a forensic accountant she found through a law school friend, been directing small but consistent payments to a subsidiary LLC that her mother and Vivian had incorporated quietly in a different state 14 months before the signing. The entire structure, the estate situation, the creditor narrative, the temporary transfer language had been constructed around a single outcome: getting Mara's signature on a document that her mother's attorney had written with enough ambiguity to make temporary a matter of interpretation. She signed it. She signed it because she was exhausted, and because her father had been genuinely ill, and because she trusted her mother with the particular irrational confidence of someone who has been conditioned since childhood to believe that family is the safest place. She signed it and went back to work the next morning, and ran both service periods and answered 43 emails, and approved the new menu insert and thought nothing of it. The first sign something was wrong arrived 6 weeks later in the form of a letter from an attorney she had never heard of, addressed to the family trust, copied to her as a former principal officer. The language was dense, and she had to read it 3 times before she understood what she was reading. She was no longer listed as a principal officer of the Copper Kettle, LLC. She had been reclassified as a former operator under temporary management agreement, which had, according to the document, expired at the 30-day mark per A clause on page 4 of the transfer agreement that Mara had signed, without reading closely enough because her mother had told her not to worry about the legal language because Gerald had reviewed everything. She called her mother that evening. The conversation was 15 minutes long, and she remembered almost none of it word for word except for the final thing her mother said before the line went quiet. "Vivian needs this, Mara. You've always had everything. You'll be fine." The line did not go dead dramatically. Her mother simply stopped talking, and the silence stretched for 3 seconds. And then there was a soft click, and Mara was standing in the kitchen of her apartment above the restaurant she no longer legally owned, holding her phone against the side of her face, listening to nothing. She did not cry that night. She had expected herself to, had even stood over the kitchen sink for a moment, bracing for it the way you brace for a sneeze that does not come. Instead, she felt something settle into place in the center of her chest, something dense and quiet, like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream. She recognized it as the same feeling she had experienced the first morning she had ever worked a health inspection shift. The day she had walked into a restaurant at 7 in the morning with a clipboard and a thermometer and the authority of the city behind her, and understood for the first time that knowledge was not passive. Knowledge was something you could deploy. She went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing. The first column was everything she knew about the Copper Kettle's operations, its supplier relationships, its lease terms, its kitchen equipment specifications, its staffing structure, its health and safety compliance history. She had built every part of that system herself, and she knew it with the precision of someone who had designed it from scratch. The second column was everything she knew about her mother and Vivian's actual operational competence. Which was the polite way of saying she documented their specific gaps. Vivian had worked 2 shifts in the kitchen during the restaurant's early days, and had caused 2 equipment near misses in one afternoon, the details of which were documented in Mara's own incident log. Her mother had been involved in the finances of one previous business venture, a specialty retail shop in the early 2000s, that had been closed by the city after a building code inspection found 12 outstanding violations. Mara had known about that history. She had simply, in the architecture of her own optimism, chosen not to apply it. The third column was the legal landscape. She was not an attorney, but she had, in the course of running a food service business for 8 years, Mia developed a relationship with commercial and regulatory law that most restaurant owners never achieved because most restaurant owners hired that knowledge out and forgot about it. She knew the state's food establishment regulations the way some people know the lyrics to songs they grew up with. She had read the full regulatory code not once but 3 times. The first time when she opened the restaurant, the second time when she expanded to a second location, the third time when she had sat on a city advisory panel for small business food safety and been asked to present to new operators. She knew which violations were correctable on-site during inspection and which were critical findings that triggered immediate action. She knew the difference between a risk factor violation and a good retail practice violation. She knew the scoring system. She knew what a pattern of repeat violations looked like on an inspection record and what it meant for a business's standing. She drew a box around the third column and wrote 2 words inside it: institutional memory. Then she went to bed. She slept for 6 hours and 40 minutes, which was about what she always slept. And when she woke up, she lay still for a moment with her eyes open and the ceiling above her the same off-white it had always been. And she thought about what came next with the same methodical calm she brought to planning a service for 300 covers. Step 1 was the attorney. She needed someone who did not know her mother, who did not know Vivian, who had no connection to Gerald Foss or any part of the Chen family's professional network, which, in a city this size, required some navigation. She called a woman named Angela Park, who had been 2 years ahead of her at university, had gone on to law school, and had spent the last decade doing commercial litigation with a specialty in business fraud and partnership disputes. Mara had attended Angela's baby shower 6 years ago, and they had exchanged birthday messages and occasional links to articles, and that was the full extent of the relationship, which meant Angela owed her nothing and had no particular reason to be kind to her, which was exactly what she wanted. She met Angela at a coffee shop 12 blocks from the Prescott Avenue house and told the story in the same order she had written it on the legal pad, with the same absence of emotion. Angela listened without interrupting. Smoy took her own notes in a compact spiral notebook, and when Mara finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they are organizing large amounts of information. "The clause on page 4, Angela said. "You have a copy of the full agreement?" Mara slid a folder across the table. She had retrieved it from her files the morning after the phone call with her mother, and she had read it 3 times before going to the coffee shop, and she had made notations in pencil in the margins. Angela read for 7 minutes. Mara drank her coffee and watched the street outside. "This is not airtight," Angela said finally. They were careful, but not careful enough. The language about the 30-day operational reversion has a qualifier that references continued active management. And if you can document that you were still performing active management functions after the 30-day mark, that's a contestable point. "I was running both morning briefings and approving all supplier invoices through day 46, Mara said. "I have the email records. I have the signed briefing sheets." Angela wrote something in her notebook. "The subsidiary LLC they formed. How did you find that?" "A forensic accountant named Derek Sung. He did a corporate records search across 5 states based on the formation timing and the registered agent's name, which was Gerald Foss. Found the LLC on day 3 of the search. Gerald Foss is a registered agent on a company that directly benefits from a transfer he allegedly advised on as a neutral party." Angela put her pen down. "That's a conflict of interest with teeth." "I know," Mara said. "Oh, what do you want?" Angela asked. It was a direct question delivered without warmth or performance, which was why Mara had chosen her. Mara considered it for 3 seconds, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to say it correctly. "I want what's mine. I want the documentation of the fraud. I want the legal basis for a challenge. And I want you to take this case on a contingency structure, because I do not currently have liquid capital for a retainer." Angela looked at her with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite amusement, and landed somewhere between the two. "Send me all the email records by tomorrow morning," Angela said. "I'll have a preliminary opinion by end of week." That meeting had been 7 months ago. The case was building with the patient accumulation of evidence that real legal work required. Not the dramatic speed of courtroom television, but the slow, thorough construction of an argument that would be very difficult to dismiss. Angela had identified 4 specific points of contestation: the management activity evidence, the conflict of interest on Gerald Foss's part, a procedural irregularity in the notarization of the transfer document, and what Angela called the most interesting piece, which was a clause in the original Copper Kettle LLC operating agreement, drafted 8 years ago before any of this, that required unanimous member consent for any transfer of controlling interest. That clause had been in the original document because Mara had put it there. Yes, because she had read the regulatory code 3 times and understood that the protections you built into your foundational documents were the ones that mattered. Her mother had not been a member of the original LLC. The transfer document purported to give controlling interest to the family trust, but the original operating agreement's requirement for unanimous member consent had never been formally dissolved, amended, or superseded. It was still sitting there in the county records, quiet and precise, the way a landmine sits in a field long after the people who placed it have forgotten where they put it. But Mara had not told Angela everything. There was a second track, a parallel track that required no litigation, no court dates, no depositions. Also a track that moved faster and left no fingerprints that could be traced back to malice or retaliation, because it was not malice and it was not retaliation. It was simply the application of public health law. which existed for reasons that had nothing to do with Mara Chen and everything to do with the safety of the people who ate in food service establishments. She had started this track on day 60 of the new ownership. She stood on the sidewalk across from the Copper Kettle on that Tuesday evening in October, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she thought about those first 60 days. About watching Vivian post photographs from inside the restaurant on social media with captions that made Mara's back teeth press together. About the news that 3 of her senior kitchen staff had quit within the first month, including her sous chef of 4 years, a meticulous man named James Okafor, who had once reorganized the entire dry storage room alphabetically as a personal project, and who had texted Mara a single message when he left. "I can't watch this." About the supplier emails that started trickling to her old address by mistake in the first weeks, emails she technically should not have been receiving but read anyway, that showed Vivian had already switched 2 of the key produce contracts to cheaper suppliers, one of which Mara recognized as a company she herself had evaluated and rejected 2 years prior because of irregular cold chain documentation. She had not reached out to James. She had not contacted any of her former staff. She had not sent a single message to any supplier. I had not made a single phone call that could be characterized as interference with current operations. What she had done was what any member of the public could do, which was submit a complaint to the city's food safety division. She had submitted the first complaint on day 62 of the new ownership, using the city's online complaint portal, the same portal she had helped design the user interface for when she sat on the advisory panel. The complaint was specific and documented. It identified a probable violation of temperature control standards in the cold holding equipment, based on information that had come to her not through any privileged access, but through a social media video that Vivian had posted, a behind-the-scenes tour of the kitchen for her personal followers, in which a digital temperature display was briefly visible in the background, showing a reading that was 4 degrees above the required maximum for cold food storage. Mara had paused the video, taken a screenshot, notated the timestamp, and attached it to the complaint. The health department had 7 days to respond to complaints under the city's service level agreement. The response in this case was an unannounced inspection on day 71. Mara had not been there. She had not needed to be. She had simply known what would happen, because she knew the kitchen, and she knew the regulations, and she knew what Vivian did not know, which was everything. The inspection record for that first visit was public. Mara had pulled it from the city's online inspection database the morning it was posted, and she had read it at her kitchen table in the new apartment she was renting, a smaller place on Garfield Street that smelled like old paint and someone else's cooking. And she had gone through the findings with the systematic attention of someone reviewing a document in their area of expertise. 7 violations. 3 of them were what the regulatory code classified as priority items, meaning they directly related to factors that could lead to foodborne illness. Cold holding temperature violation in the reach-in cooler, consistent with the complaint. Employee observed handling ready-to-eat food with bare hands in violation of the hand contact surface requirements. Date marking absent on multiple items in cold storage, which was a repeat food safety standard violation because it made it impossible to track whether food had been held beyond safe time limits. Priority items were the ones that mattered on an inspection record, not because a single instance was necessarily catastrophic, but because of what happened when they appeared in patterns. Under the city's inspection protocol, a food establishment with 3 or more priority violations in a single inspection was required to have a follow-up visit within 30 days. If the follow-up visit found repeat priority violations, the establishment moved into a corrective action plan structure that required documented proof of remediation and could result in escalating consequences, including permit suspension. Vivian had received a corrective action notice with the first inspection. Mara knew she would have read it with the particular incomprehension of someone who had never studied the thing they were being asked to do differently. She had submitted the second complaint on day 89 of the new ownership. This one was based on something she had seen herself, standing on the sidewalk, which she did sometimes in the early morning before the breakfast service started, because she had not yet found anything better to do with her mornings. She had watched a delivery driver unload a produce order from a refrigerated truck and leave it on the sidewalk unattended for 11 minutes, while he went back to the truck for a second load. During those 11 minutes, the temperature outside was 51 degrees, which was above the threshold for safe holding of certain produce. And the items left on the sidewalk included a case of cut greens and what appeared to be packaged ready-to-eat items. She had timed the 11 minutes on her phone. She had photographed the delivery from across the street, the timestamp embedded in the image data. She had not been standing on the sidewalk to gather evidence. She had been standing on the sidewalk because she could not stop looking at the building, the way you cannot stop pressing a bruise. The evidence had simply been there. The way it always was when people who did not know the rules tried to run something that required knowing them. The second complaint had generated a second inspection on day 93. Mara had pulled that inspection record too when it was posted. 8 violations, 4 priority items. 2 of them were repeat violations from the first inspection, which was the operative fact. Repeat priority violations triggered the escalated review process. The corrective action plan filed by Vivian's new management, which appeared to have been written with the assistance of someone who had found a template online, was reviewed and found insufficient by the supervising inspector, a woman named Claudia Torres, whom Mara had worked alongside briefly during her consulting years and who was, based on everything Mara remembered about her, thorough to the point of being unrelenting. Now it was October, and Mara was standing on the sidewalk, and the smell reaching her from the ventilation exhaust above the back service door, which she could detect even from across the street, because the wind was moving in the right direction, told her that the fryer oil had not been changed in too long. And she knew the exhaust signature of clean oil versus degraded oil, the way a sommelier knows the difference between a wine that has been opened too long and one that has not. She was not going to file a complaint about fryer oil. She did not need to. The third complaint had already been submitted 6 days ago. This one had arrived not from her own observation, but from a source she had not anticipated and had not solicited, which was the universe operating with a symmetry she had learned not to trust, but could not help noticing. James Okafor had sent her an email. Not because she had reached out to him, not because she had asked him for anything. He had sent it because he had been contacted by a former colleague who was still working at the Copper Kettle, a prep cook named Danny, who had stayed on through the transition and was now deeply uncomfortable with what she was being asked to do in the kitchen, which included being told by Vivian's new kitchen manager to reuse marinade that had contacted raw poultry as a basting liquid for cooked items. Danny had gone to James because James was the person she trusted, and James had forwarded the information to Mara because James was the kind of person who, when he encountered something wrong, went to the person most equipped to address it. Mara had replied to James with 2 sentences. "I'm not in a position to involve you in anything active. If Danny wants to file a complaint, she can use the city portal and the complaint will be investigated on its merits. She should include as much specific detail as possible, including dates and names." And James had sent back a single word, understood. Danny's complaint, filed independently in her own name, with specific dates and the name of the kitchen manager who had given the instruction, had been submitted to the city portal 4 days ago. The combination of Danny's complaint and the open corrective action plan from the second inspection had triggered what the city's food safety protocol called a complaint concurrent follow-up inspection, meaning an inspection not scheduled on the standard calendar, but driven by the intersection of an active complaint and an outstanding corrective action. Those inspections were assigned to senior inspectors. They were not announced. They happened when the inspector had availability, which under the current city staffing structure meant within 5 to 15 business days of the trigger event. Mara calculated. Standing on the sidewalk in October, her hands in her pockets, her breath visible in the cold air, she calculated the inspection window with the same precision she used to calculate par levels for a busy weekend service. The inspection would come. It would find what it found, which would be what she knew it would find, because she had built that kitchen, and she knew where every corner was cut and where every system required active management to stay in compliance. And she knew that Vivian was not providing that management. She was providing photographs for social media and new seasonal menu inserts that did not address the fact that the kitchen running those menus was operating with the structural integrity of a building whose load-bearing walls had been quietly removed. She turned away from the window and walked back toward Garfield Street. There was a coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment that was open until 11 and where the barista knew her order and did not attempt conversation, which she appreciated. She went there most evenings and sat at the small table near the back with her laptop and worked. And the working was not what most people would have expected from someone in her situation, which was that she was not spending her evenings planning the legal case or composing grievance documents. She was spending her evenings building the next business. This was the part of the story that nobody who had known Mara Chen before the signing would have predicted, because the person they had known had been defined almost entirely by the copper kettle, by the particular identity that forms when you build something from nothing over the course of 8 years and watch it become a real thing in the world. Mara before the signing had been the woman who could tell you the origin story of every item on the menu, who had personally tested every supplier relationship, who had driven to the distribution warehouse herself once to observe cold chain handling because she did not like the temperature variance she had seen on 2 consecutive deliveries and wanted to understand the point of failure rather than just the symptom. That woman was still there. She had not lost the knowledge when she lost the building. What she had lost was the frame. And she had spent approximately 6 weeks grieving the frame before she understood that the knowledge itself was the asset and the frame was something she could build again. The new business was not a restaurant. It was a consulting firm. Specifically, it was a food safety and operational compliance consultancy targeting independent and small chain food establishments. The business plan was on her laptop in a file she had started on day 45 of the new ownership and had been refining ever since. And it was, objectively, more viable than the copper kettle had been in its first year because it required almost no capital outlay, and its primary asset was the knowledge she had been accumulating for 11 years, none of which could be transferred, signed over, or taken from her by anyone with a document and a ballpoint pen. She had spent 3 months writing the service framework, which detailed 4 tiers of consulting engagement, from a single compliance audit with a written report to a full operational integration package where she would embed with a client's kitchen team for a defined period and redesign their systems from the inside. She had spent 6 weeks developing her proprietary audit tool, a digital assessment instrument that mapped 37 inspection categories against a weighted risk scoring system she had designed based on the actual inspection findings data she had analyzed during her time with the Food Safety Division. The tool was not available anywhere else. It was hers. She had registered the business on the same day she submitted the first complaint against the copper kettle, and which she recognized later as a detail that contained a kind of poetry she would not have planned deliberately. The firm was called Meridian Food Systems, a name she had chosen because it was professional and unmemorable, in the way a scalpel is unmemorable, which was to say it communicated only function and left nothing for anyone to attach a narrative to. She had 3 clients before the end of her first month. 2 of them came through the advisory panel network from her years of city work. One came through a referral from Derek Sung, the forensic accountant, who had run into a restaurant owner dealing with a permit complication and had mentioned her name. She had invoiced $14,000 in her first full operating month, which was less than the copper kettle had generated in revenue per week, but which was also pure margin, because she had no overhead, no staff costs, no supplier relationships, no equipment leases, and no building. She had an LLC, a laptop, a professional liability insurance policy, and the most specific kind of expertise that exists, which is the kind that comes from having done the thing yourself, badly, and then better, and then very well, before learning to teach it to other people. By October, she had 11 active clients across the city and had hired her first part-time associate, a former health department inspector named Marcus Bello, who had retired early due to a back problem and was deeply eager to continue doing work that used his knowledge of the regulatory code. She was paying him per engagement at a rate that was fair and that he had told her, without prompting, was better than what he had received from 2 other consulting outfits he had worked with briefly after retiring. Marcus was thorough and quiet and had a gift for explaining critical violations to restaurant owners in a way that produced compliance rather than defensiveness, which was a skill Mara valued extremely highly because defensiveness was the enemy of corrective action. The business was real. It was generating revenue. It had clients who referred other clients. It required her knowledge and her specific experience and her professional reputation, all of which were intact. The lawsuit was proceeding. Angela had filed the initial complaint in civil court 6 weeks ago, and Mara's mother's attorney had responded with a motion to dismiss that Angela had described as aggressive but not strong, and the motion had been scheduled for a hearing in January. Angela had also filed a separate complaint with the state's professional licensing board regarding Gerald Foss's conflict of interest, and that proceeding was moving on its own parallel track. And the health department was doing what the health department did, which was apply the city's food establishment regulations to every establishment equally, without regard to ownership history or family dynamics or the specific operational knowledge that the previous owner happened to have accumulated. Mara ordered her coffee and opened her laptop and did not think about what was happening across town in the kitchen she used to run until the notification arrived on her phone at 8:47 that evening, which was a Google alert she had set up months ago for the copper kettle's name in local news. She looked at the notification. She did not open it immediately. She drank approximately a third of her coffee, opened the Meridian client file she had been working on, made 3 notes about the refrigeration unit recommendations for the commercial commissary client she was seeing on Thursday, and then set down her coffee and opened the news notification. It was a brief item in the city's local news digest, the kind of item that ran under a small headline and was usually read only by people with a specific reason to care. So, the Copper Kettle on Raleigh Street had received a conditional closure notice following a routine inspection. The notice required the establishment to cease food service operations until specified violations were corrected and a re-inspection confirmed compliance. The facility's health score had dropped to 61 following the latest inspection. The item included the public record inspection findings, which she read carefully. 11 violations, 6 priority items. 3 of the 6 were repeats from previous inspections, which under the city's regulatory structure triggered automatic escalation to the conditional closure protocol. The repeat violations included the temperature control violation, the date marking violation, and what the report listed as improper cooling methods for cooked/hot foods, which was a violation category that carried a high risk factor because improperly cooled cooked food was one of the most reliable ways to create conditions for bacterial growth that could cause serious illness in customers. There was also a new finding: pest activity evidence in the dry storage area, specifically rodent droppings in 2 locations. This was a critical violation, the highest severity category in the inspection framework, the kind that on its own could trigger immediate action. Combined with the repeat priority violations and the insufficient corrective action history, it had resulted in the conditional closure. Mara set her phone down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. She felt nothing dramatic, no surge of satisfaction, no relief, no guilt. What she felt was the quiet recognition of outcome that follows from correctly applied knowledge, the same feeling she had experienced years ago when she had watched a corrective action plan she had written for a client produce clean inspection results over the following 6 months. The problem had been real. The solution had been technically correct. The outcome had followed. She thought briefly about the customers, about the people who might have eaten at the Copper Kettle under Vivian's management, who had eaten food held at improper temperatures, food stored without date marking, food potentially contaminated by the conditions that had produced the pest evidence. She felt something about that, and a low-grade anger that was not about herself, but about the people who had ordered a meal and trusted the establishment to have earned that trust. That was the actual harm in food safety violations, not a score on a document. People. She finished her coffee and saved her work and put on her coat. Walking back to Garfield Street, she thought about the conditional closure's practical implications. A conditional closure was not a permanent closure. It was a suspension of operations pending corrective action, and it could theoretically be lifted in 2 to 4 weeks if the operator addressed the violations and passed re-inspection. She knew from her time with the Food Safety Division that the success rate on first attempt reinspection for establishments with repeat priority violations and critical findings was approximately 40%. That was because the underlying issue in those cases was almost never equipment or procedure in isolation. It was operational knowledge. You could fix the reach-in cooler, you could throw away the improperly dated items, you could treat the pest issue. But if the people running the kitchen did not understand why those systems failed and how to prevent recurrence, the findings came back. They always came back. She thought about Vivian, about her sister standing in that kitchen at whatever hour the inspection had happened today, faced with a notice that carried the weight of the city's public health authority behind it, holding a document whose language she probably did not fully understand. Looking at the restaurant that she had been handed with the casual confidence of someone who had never considered that possessing something and knowing how to run it were completely different skills, she thought about her mother, about the phone call that was probably happening right now, Vivian calling Diane in the voice she used for catastrophes, which was actually just a louder version of her normal voice because Vivian had not yet learned the distinction between disaster and inconvenience. About her mother trying to project calm the way she always did, the lavender and synthetic calm, the everything will be fine voice that Mara had spent 34 years believing before she understood it was not calm at all, but the auditory equivalent of the plug-in air freshener, covering something else, making the space bearable through chemical means. She did not feel sorry for either of them. She unlocked the door to her apartment and went inside and hung up her coat and washed her hands at the kitchen sink with the particular thoroughness she had never been able to stop even when she was not in a commercial kitchen. 20 seconds minimum, both sides, between the fingers. A habit from years of enforcing the rule. An automatic gesture that had outlived its original context and now just lived in her body as a small, clean ritual. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and opened her legal pad to a clean page. The conditional closure was public record. Angela would see it. The implications for the civil case were worth thinking through carefully. I knew the existence of documented operational failures under the family trust's management was relevant context for the argument that the transfer had harmed rather than protected the business asset. It added dimension to the case that Angela had not specifically anticipated, but would know how to use. She wrote 3 notes on the legal pad and drew arrows between them. Then she circled the second note twice, not for emphasis, but as a reminder to herself to send the public inspection record to Angela in the morning. Just the public record. Just the document that anyone could pull from the city database. That was all. That was all it had ever been. She drank her tea and the apartment was quiet around her, and the radiator in the corner worked without drama. Just warmth, steady and consistent, which she appreciated. See, outside on Garfield Street, there was the distant sound of a bus and someone's music from an upstairs apartment and the general ambient texture of a city continuing to operate. She thought about the morning. She had a client meeting at 9. A family-owned Lebanese restaurant that had received a corrective action notice on their first inspection after new management took over from a retiring parent. Good people, genuinely committed to doing things right, in need of someone who could walk them through the gap between their intentions and the regulatory requirements. She had been there twice already, and she liked them with the professional warmth that is distinct from personal affinity, the appreciation you feel for people who engage with information seriously and apply it instead of arguing with it. After that, she had 2 hours of desk time and then a call with a hotel group that was considering engaging Meridian for a portfolio audit across their food and beverage operations in 5 properties, which was the largest engagement she had been in conversation about, and which, if it proceeded, would require her to bring Marcus on full-time and potentially hire a second associate. She had spent 3 evenings this week preparing for that call. The business was growing. That was the accurate phrase for what was happening. Not recovering, not rebuilding, not any of the words that implied loss as the primary context. Growing. From a different seed than she had planted before, in different soil, with different conditions, but growing with the same purposeful direction that anything grows when it has adequate resources and correct conditions. Oh, she finished her tea and rinsed the cup. She thought, as she sometimes did, about the specific moment of the signing, about her hand holding the pen, about the way the document had looked on the kitchen table. 11 pages, the last 3 of which she had not read closely enough. She thought about what she would have done differently if she had known. Not just about reading page 4, about all of it. Whether she would have built the same business in the same way if she had not trusted the people she trusted. Whether the trust itself had been a mistake, or whether it had been the reasonable response of someone operating in good faith, and the mistake had been in the other party, and not in her. She had decided, sometime around month 3, that this line of thinking was not useful, not because it was painful, but because it was imprecise. The question was not whether she would have made different choices with foreknowledge. The question was what she was going to do with the knowledge she actually had, which was considerable and growing. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. She slept for 6 hours and 38 minutes. The reinspection request that the Copper Kettle filed with the city came on day 92 of the operational disruption, which was 11 days after the conditional closure. Mara knew this because reinspection requests were public record too, logged in the same database as inspection results. She checked the database the way she checked her email, as part of a morning routine that was not obsessive but was organized. Organized was different from obsessive. Organized was professional. All of the reinspection had been submitted with a corrective action documentation package that, also based on the city's requirements, would need to demonstrate that each priority violation and the critical violation had been addressed. Mara had not seen the package. She did not need to. What she knew was that the pest activity, critical violation, the rodent droppings in dry storage, required not just the removal of the evidence, but the documentation of a professional pest management service, the sealing of identified entry points, and the implementation of an ongoing monitoring program. This was not something that could be done adequately in 11 days, in a building that was attached to a shared commercial structure with a common basement level. She knew the building. And she had fought with the property management company about the basement access for 2 years. She knew also that the repeat priority violations could not be addressed by corrective action documentation alone. The temperature control violation required either equipment repair documentation from a licensed refrigeration contractor showing the specific fault identified and corrected, or a capital replacement of the unit with the new unit's temperature log. The date marking violation required a demonstrated system for labeling that involved staff training documentation. The cooling methods violation required proof of a specific protocol change, time temperature logs showing the new procedure, and staff training acknowledgement signatures. Vivian had 11 days to produce all of this. Mara had watched Vivian attempt to manage a brunch service and been unable to find a coherent organizational system in the 43 minutes she had observed from the kitchen doorway before she left. The probability that Vivian had produced a complete, technically accurate corrective action package in 11 days was something Mara could not calculate precisely, but could estimate within a reasonable range. The reinspection result was posted to the public database on day 96. She looked at it at 6:47 in the morning with her first cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table on Garfield Street, in the thin gray light of early November. The reinspection had found 3 priority violations still present. 2 of them were repeats of repeats, the temperature control and date marking. Almost the pest activity evidence had been addressed, but the inspector's notes indicated insufficient sealing of structural entry points, monitoring system documentation incomplete. The facility score remained below the threshold for operational resumption. The conditional closure was upheld. A facility operating under a conditional closure that failed reinspection moved, under the city's regulatory protocol, to a status review by the division director, which was a formal process that assessed the establishment's history of compliance and its realistic capacity for achieving sustained compliance. That assessment could result in an extended closure, a permit suspension, or in cases where the pattern of violations and the failed corrective action demonstrated that the operator lacked the capacity to operate in compliance with public health standards, a recommendation for permit revocation. Permit revocation was not immediate. It involved a notice period, a right to appeal, a hearing process. But it was the end of the line. A food establishment without a permit could not operate. A permit revocation was a public record. It followed the business entity and its principles in ways that made future permitting significantly more difficult. The division director review was scheduled, according to the notification on the public database, for the following Wednesday. Mara had a client site visit on Wednesday morning, and the hotel group call at 2 in the afternoon, and a Meridian Systems update meeting with Marcus at 4. She noted the division director review time, which was listed as 11 in the morning, and thought about whether she would attend. It was a public proceeding. She had the right to attend. She was also a member of the public who had filed complaints that had contributed to the inspection record under review. And while that was a legitimate exercise of the public complaint system and not something she had any reason to be defensive about, she thought about the optics of sitting in that room. She decided she would not attend. Not because she was avoiding anything, but because it was not necessary and not useful to her and she had work to do. See, she sent Angela an email that morning with the reinspection results and a note that said, "Division Director review scheduled Wednesday. I will not be attending. The inspection record is public. Let me know if this changes anything for our timeline." Angela replied by noon. It actually helps. The pattern of violations under their management goes directly to the question of business value diminishment, which is part of our damages calculation. She's running the asset into the ground. That's an argument, not just an outcome. Mara read the email twice and wrote back, "I know. That's why I documented it." She closed the email and went back to the Meridian quarterly projection spreadsheet she had been working on. The hotel group call was in 2 days, and she wanted the projections clean and conservative and supported by actual client data. Oh, not optimism. She had built a business on actual client data before. She knew what it looked like when a projection was honest and what it looked like when it was performance. She preferred honest. The division director review took place on a Wednesday morning that Mara spent at a restaurant in the Westgate neighborhood, walking the kitchen with the owner and his daughter, who was taking over day-to-day operations, and going through the results of the compliance audit she had completed the previous week. The owner's name was Kareem, and he had been running the restaurant for 19 years and had 3 excellent inspections in a row before a management gap after his wife's illness had resulted in a corrective action notice. And he understood food safety the way people understand things they have respected for a long time. So what he needed was not education, but a systematic reset. And Mara was good at systematic resets because she thought in systems. They were in the walk-in cooler reviewing the new temperature logging protocol when her phone vibrated. She looked at it briefly. Angela. She put it back in her pocket and finished the walk-in review and explained the logging frequency and showed Kareem's daughter the city's threshold requirements and the buffer she recommended maintaining to provide a cushion against equipment variance. Then she excused herself and stepped out to the back corridor and called Angela. The division director issued the suspension, Angela said without preamble. Mara leaned against the corridor wall. How long? Indefinite, pending resolution of a full compliance hearing, which, given the backlog in that office, is 8 to 12 weeks. She can apply to lift it with a demonstrated corrective action plan, but the director's assessment noted that the 2 failed re-inspections suggest the current operator lacks the technical competence to achieve sustained compliance. That language, the language about technical competence, is going to be difficult to overcome. What's the appeal process? She can appeal to the division director within 30 days, and if that's denied, she can appeal to the city's regulatory review board. But realistically, an indefinite suspension with a technical competence finding is not something you fight in 3 months, not if the underlying conditions don't change. Mara was quiet for a moment. And the civil case? The civil case just got a new argument, Angela said. Oh, an indefinitely suspended food establishment with a documented pattern of regulatory failure under the new management is an asset that has been materially damaged. I can now argue not just fraud and procedural error in the transfer, but actual quantifiable business harm. The valuation gap between the copper kettle on the day of the transfer and the copper kettle as it currently stands is significant. How significant? Conservatively, based on the revenue figures from your pre-transfer period versus the current suspended status, we are talking about a number that makes the contingency arrangement work well for both of us. Mara pushed off the wall and stood straight. Send me the formal summary when you have it. I want to review the damages calculation before the next filing. Obviously, Angela said. Oh, are you all right? It was a question that Mara did not immediately know how to answer, not because she was not all right, but because the definition of all right in this context required more precision than the question offered. She was employed. She was solvent. Her business was growing at a rate she had not projected. The legal case was strengthening. The person who had taken what was hers had, in the process of holding it incorrectly, demonstrated to the public record that she did not know how to hold it. I'm in the middle of a client meeting, Mara said. Nah, I'll call you tonight. She went back into the kitchen and finished the walk-in review, and then walked Kareem and his daughter through the dry storage reorganization protocol and the revised receiving checklist and the staff training documentation system she had designed for Meridian clients, which was color-coded and laminated and required a signature for each completed module. and which Marcus had told her was the single most practically useful tool they provided. She told Kareem that she would schedule a follow-up visit in 3 weeks to review implementation, and that if he had questions before then, he should email the Meridian shared inbox, which she and Marcus both monitored. Kareem shook her hand at the end and held it a moment longer than a standard professional handshake, with the grip of someone who understood the value of what had just happened in his kitchen. His daughter handed her a small paper bag that turned out, when she opened it in the car, to contain 2 pieces of something wrapped in foil that smelled like cardamom and butter, the specific warm smell of a kitchen that is cared for, that is being run by people who are paying attention. She drove back to her apartment and ate the pastries at the kitchen table, and they were very good. She sat with that for a moment. The simple fact of the good pastry, the kitchen it came from, the people who made it, the work she had done that morning that was real and useful and used the best of what she knew. Then she opened her laptop and went back to the hotel group projections. The month that followed was the fullest she had experienced since before the signing. The hotel group engagement came through, a 12-month portfolio audit contract that was, at the rate they had negotiated, the largest single contract Meridian had signed. She brought Marcus on full-time and began the process of hiring a second associate, conducting interviews the way she had always conducted them, with specific technical questions about the regulatory code and scenario-based exercises that revealed how a candidate thought through a compliance problem rather than just how they talked about one. She found a candidate she liked, a woman named Petra, who had managed food safety for a regional catering company and had the particular combination of technical knowledge and communication skill that Mara valued most highly. So the civil case moved toward the discovery phase, which meant that documents were being exchanged and depositions were being scheduled. Angela had requested Gerald Foss's financial records related to the subsidiary LLC and the communications between Gerald and Mara's mother in the 18 months before the signing. And the other side was resisting with the standard procedural objections that Angela had told Mara to expect and not to read as strength. The resistance was pro forma. The documents existed. They would be produced. Mara's mother called her once during this period. It was a Saturday morning in late November, and Mara was in the coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment, and her mother's name appeared on her phone screen with the same visual neutrality as any other name in her contacts. She looked at it through 3 rings. Aware that she was going to answer, deciding how. Mara. Her mother's voice was careful, the lavender voice. Vivian is in a very difficult position. I know, Mara said. The restaurant has been suspended. She's lost the staff. She doesn't know what to do. I know, Mara said again. A silence. Her mother was waiting for something that Mara recognized as the shape of the conversation her mother wanted to have, which was a conversation where Mara offered to help, where she allowed herself to be positioned as the competent sibling whose knowledge was a resource that the family could access when it needed something from her, where the fact of her expertise became a reason to be generous rather than a reason to see clearly. There's a situation with the lease, her mother said, which was an opening line for a new paragraph of the conversation. The property owner is sending notices. If the permit situation doesn't resolve in the next 30 days... Mom, Mara said. The word landed in the silence between them like a stone on ice. Angela Park filed our discovery request on Thursday, Mara said. You'll receive a notification from your attorney about the financial records request. Gerald Foss's records are included. That process will move on its own schedule. I'm not going to have a separate conversation about Vivian's operational situation. Mara, if you would just... I have to go, Mara said. Tell your attorney to call Angela if there's something to discuss. She set the phone face down on the table and drank her coffee and returned to the analysis she had been working on, which was a gap assessment for one of the hotel properties in the portfolio, a property whose kitchen team had not had a comprehensive compliance review in 3 years, and whose practices had a certain settled-in quality that meant the problems were old and comfortable, and would require some active dismantling to address. She was writing the preliminary findings section, and she wanted it specific and constructive and clear, the way a good corrective action plan was always specific and constructive and clear, because a finding was only useful if it pointed toward the correction rather than just documenting the failure. She did not think about the phone call again for the rest of the morning. The days had a texture now that was different from both what had come before the signing and what had come immediately after it, before. The days had been full with the weight of the restaurant, the operational mass of a physical business that required her presence in a specific place at specific times, that defined her schedule and therefore her sense of self in ways she had not fully understood until that structure was removed. After the signing, the days had a hollow quality that she did not permit herself to wallow in, but that she was honest enough to acknowledge, a sense of displacement that was not grief exactly but was related to it. The loss of a daily practice that had organized her perception of herself. Now the days had the texture of a different kind of work, the kind that moved through the world rather than staying in one place, the kind that required her to apply what she knew in different contexts and keep refining the application. She drove to different kitchens, she assessed different systems, she found different expressions of the same underlying problems, the universal human tendency to let procedures slide when the pressure is on and the time is short and the inspector is not expected until next month. She worked against that tendency. She built systems that made compliance easier than non-compliance, which was the actual goal of good food safety design, not enforcement, but design. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, and now she was better because she had failed publicly and been taken apart by people she trusted and had rebuilt herself without anyone's help, which teaches you things about the architecture of yourself that comfort cannot teach. So she thought sometimes about what she would say to someone who came to her in the situation she had been in 8 months ago, someone who had lost something they had built, to people who had used their trust against them. She thought about what the actual advice would be, stripped of the platitudes about resilience and moving forward that she had heard from well-meaning people and found useless. The advice would be, become more expert than you already are, specifically in the domain of your loss, because expertise is the one thing that cannot be transferred by a coerced signature. Build something parallel that converts your expertise into revenue as fast as possible, because financial independence is the operational requirement for every other kind of independence. Want to document everything in the present tense because documentation is the vocabulary of systems, and systems are what you use to make outcomes legible to authorities who can act on them. Do not telegraph your movements. Do not make phone calls driven by anger. Do not post anything on social media about the situation. Let the public record do its work because public records are patient and do not require your emotional management. That was the advice. She had not given it to anyone because no one had asked her for it, but it was there, precise and applicable, waiting for the right question. The division director's suspension held through December. Vivian's appeal to the division director was denied in the 3rd week of December, the result of a hearing that was also on the public record and that Mara read in the city database with the same clinical attention she brought to all the inspection records. The hearing officer's notes indicated that Vivian's legal representative had argued procedural grounds and had not been able to produce adequate evidence of a remediation plan with sufficient technical specificity to address the competence finding. That was the expected outcome. You cannot argue against a technical competence finding by hiring an attorney who does not understand the regulatory code. You need someone who understands the regulatory code. And Vivian did not know anyone like that. Or if she had once known someone like that, that person was currently running a different business and was not available for consultation. Angela called her the week before Christmas, with a tone in her voice that Mara had learned over the past months to associate with good news delivered by someone who had done a lot of work to get there and did not want to overstate it. Gerald Foss's bank records came through, Angela said. All of them. Mara set down what she was holding. There are 47 payments over a 14-month period, Angela said, ranging from $2,000 to $12,000, all from the family trust account to the subsidiary LLC. The payments began 3 months before your father's illness was cited as the reason for the transfer. The last payment was made 9 days after you signed. 47 payments, Mara said. 47. The total is $261,000. Whilst the payments are coded in the trust accounting records as consulting fees. What consulting services did Gerald Foss provide to the subsidiary LLC? As far as we can tell from the records produced, none. There is no deliverable, no project documentation, no formal engagement letter, just payments. Mara was quiet. That is not consulting fees, Angela said. That is a disbursement structure. That is someone moving money from a trust that was supposed to be managing a business asset into a vehicle that directly benefits the people who created that vehicle for the purpose of extracting value from the asset rather than managing it. That's embezzlement, Mara said. That is what I am going to argue. Yes, Angela said. With supporting documentation from a forensic accountant and a damages analysis that now includes the permit suspension. We are no longer looking at a civil fraud case. We are looking at a case that could be referred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Mara sat with that for a long moment. The apartment was quiet around her. December light came through the window at the low angle it takes in winter, the light that does not warm anything, but illuminates everything with a particular flat precision. What's the timeline from here? She asked. I want to file an amended complaint in January incorporating the financial forensics findings. I'd also like to have a conversation with you about whether you want to engage the DA's office proactively or wait to see if they pick it up from the civil filing. What's your recommendation? Proactive engagement, Angela said. You have cleaner hands in the civil case if you've already flagged the criminal dimension. It signals that you're not using the civil process as leverage for something else. You're reporting what you found. Do it, Mara said. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall. $261,000. Over 14 months. While she had been running the kitchen, writing the seasonal menus, training the staff, negotiating the supplier contracts, maintaining the inspection record that had never once triggered a corrective action notice in 8 years of operation. While she had been building the thing they had decided to take from her, they had been building the mechanism to extract it. And the mechanism had been running for over a year before she sat in that kitchen with the lavender smell and the pen in her hand. She was not surprised. She had not been surprised exactly since the night she had written the 3 columns on the legal pad. But there is a difference between knowing the general shape of what happened to you and seeing the specific numbers, the specific dates, the specific movements of money that constitute the evidence of intention. The numbers made the intention legible. The intention had always been there, underneath the family conversation, and the lavender air freshener, and her mother's voice saying, "It's temporary," but now it had a dollar amount and 47 data points and a paper trail that ended in a city regulatory database showing an indefinitely suspended food establishment and the specific, documented inadequacy of the people who had decided they could run something they did not understand. She did not feel triumphant. She felt precise. She opened her laptop and went back to the hotel portfolio assessment. She had a deliverable due to the client by January 5th, and she wanted it finished before Christmas, so she could take 3 days off, which she had not done in a year, and which Marcus had been politely suggesting was something she should consider. She was going to take 3 days and go somewhere with a water view and sleep past 7 in the morning and eat food that someone else had made in a kitchen she had not assessed. And when she came back, she was going to build the next quarter's client roster and finalize Petra's employment agreement and prepare for the January court filing. The business was real. And the case was real. The numbers were in a document with a forensic accountant's name on them. She worked until 10:30 and then made dinner. A simple thing, pasta with olive oil and garlic and some dried herbs from a jar she had found at the back of a cabinet that were older than she would have permitted in her own restaurant, but which she used anyway because she was not in her own restaurant, and the rules were different here, and different was not worse. It was just different. She ate at the kitchen table and read the hotel portfolio notes over dinner and made a few corrections and then washed the dishes and went to bed. The second location of the Copper Kettle on Meridian Avenue received its own conditional closure notice in January. Mara found out from the public database. It had been running under the same family trust management structure with a general manager installed by Vivian who, based on what the public inspection record showed, had been trained in the same gaps that Vivian herself had not been trained to address. 3 priority violations, 2 of them matching the categories from the Raleigh Street location, which was what happened when the training deficit existed at the management level rather than the staff level. You could retrain a prep cook. You could not retrain a general manager who did not know what they did not know. The third location, which had always been the youngest and most operationally precarious, had quietly closed before the inspection system caught it. The lease surrendered in December without public announcement. Oh, Mara found out from a note in the city's business registration database showing the LLC filing for that location had been updated to reflect a cessation of operations. She had built that location from scratch over 16 months, and it had done its best work in its second year, and she had been proud of it in the specific, quiet way that you are proud of things you were not certain you could do. It was gone until she held that for a few minutes. Not grief, not satisfaction, but something in between that did not have a precise name. The recognition that objects built with care do not become uncared for things gracefully. They just become empty buildings with someone else's name on the permit application. The civil case amended complaint was filed on January 17th. Angela had prepared it with the meticulous attention to detail that Mara had hired her for, and it was long and specific and documented and incorporated the financial forensics report from Derek Sung with full evidentiary attachment. The damages calculation was substantial. Angela had estimated, conservatively, a range that Mara had read twice and then set down on the table and looked at with the same neutral recognition she brought to the inspection database. The motion to dismiss was withdrawn by the other side 3 days after the amended complaint was filed. Mara's mother's attorney filed for a 60-day extension to prepare a response, which Angela did not oppose because she did not need to. The extension was a signal. At the other side was reading the amended complaint and understanding what it contained and determining whether to fight or to settle. And that determination was going to take longer than the 30-day window they had originally been operating in. Gerald Foss had surrendered his accounting license 2 weeks after the bank records were produced in discovery, before Angela had filed the amended complaint, in a sequence of events that Mara noted with interest. He had cited personal health reasons in his resignation letter to the state licensing board. She doubted the accuracy of that description, but did not pursue it. His license was gone. That was sufficient. The DA's office had opened a preliminary inquiry based on Angela's referral. That process moved on its own schedule and with its own logic, and Mara had limited visibility into it, which was appropriate. She had not filed the referral because she wanted a particular outcome. She had filed it because the information she had was real and the DA's office was the correct institutional destination for it. What happened from there was not her responsibility. She focused on Meridian. By February, the client roster had grown to 22 active engagements. Petra had been with the firm for 6 weeks and had already demonstrated the particular quality Mara had identified in her interview, the ability to explain a regulatory requirement in the exact language that a specific person could absorb, which varied enormously between a first-generation restaurant owner who had been cooking the same food the same way for 30 years and a hospitality corporation executive who communicated primarily in the language of liability management. Petra could do both. Marcus had told Mara that Petra was the best hire she had made, which coming from Marcus was the highest available endorsement because Marcus did not say things he did not mean. She was at the Meridian desk in her apartment on a Thursday morning in late February when the settlement offer came through. Angela emailed it with a subject line that said only, "Read this first and then call me." She read it. Then she called Angela. "They want to settle," Angela said. "The number is—" "I saw the number. It's within the range we calculated. Slightly below midpoint." "It includes the restaurant asset?" Mara asked. Because there were 2 things on the table. The money, which was the embezzled amount, plus damages, plus interest and legal fees. And the business. The operating agreement's unanimous consent clause was still there in the county records. Angela's argument was that the transfer had been invalid from the beginning, which meant that legal ownership of the Copper Kettle LLC had never actually transferred. If the court agreed, the business was still Mara's, legally, regardless of what had been done to it operationally. "They want to keep the business entity," Angela said, "or rather, they want the right to wind it down without litigation. They're offering a buyout number for your interest in the LLC. And the buyout number, also in the range. High end of what I'd call fair, given the current suspended status." Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the building on Raleigh Street. About the kitchen she had designed with a specific flow in mind, the way the stations moved from left to right with the cold prep at the far end, and the hot line angled to minimize crossing paths during service. about the dim lamp in the front window that she had specifically chosen because the color temperature was warm without being dim, the particular hospitality of a light that looked expensive but was not, about the 8 years of service and the inspection records and the staff she had trained and the supplier relationships she had built by showing up consistently and paying on time and not asking for anything she hadn't earned, about the people who had eaten the food cooked in that kitchen under her management and had come back because they had come back. The repeat customer base that was the only real measure of a restaurant's value, the only vote that counted. She thought about the Meridian clients, about Kareem's kitchen and the temperature log she had designed, and his daughter's serious, attentive eyes following her explanation of the cold chain protocol, about the hotel portfolio and the systematic improvements she was documenting across 5 properties, about the problem she was good at, which was making food service environments safer and more efficient and better run, which she could do now in 22 places at once instead of 3. She thought about the building on Raleigh Street with its indefinitely suspended permit and its failed re-inspections and whatever was currently happening inside it, the accumulated consequence of 14 months of mismanagement by people who had wanted the thing without understanding what the thing required. Counter with a number 15% above the buyout offer, she said, and full release of all future claims related to the transfer and the embezzlement, and legal fees at full amount. They might say no to the embezzlement release, Angela said. They may want to keep that exposure unresolved as leverage. Then we don't settle, Mara said. The DA's inquiry is running on its own. I don't need their cooperation to protect my criminal exposure. Well, they need mine. A pause on Angela's end that meant she was either writing something down or thinking something through or both. That's a strong position, Angela said. I built 3 restaurant locations in 8 years, Mara said. I know what a strong position looks like. Angela's counter was sent on a Friday. The response came back on Monday. They accepted the counter on the buyout number and the embezzlement release. They pushed back on the legal fees, offering 70%. Angela advised accepting. Mara accepted. The settlement agreement was drafted and reviewed and executed over the following 2 weeks, a process that felt, in its precision and its paperwork and its deliberate formality, like the correct ending for a story that had started with a document and a ballpoint pen in a kitchen that smelled like lavender. She did not feel relief when she signed the settlement agreement. She felt the same thing she felt when she signed the hotel portfolio contract, or the Meridian LLC formation documents, or the employment agreement with Petra, which was the specific low-key satisfaction of a document that said accurately what it was supposed to say and placed the correct obligations on the correct parties. The satisfaction of a system working the way a system was designed to work. She sent Angela a bottle of wine because Angela had asked for nothing beyond the contingency arrangement and had worked as though it were the only case on her docket, which it obviously was not, and because acknowledging good work was something Mara had always done and intended to continue doing. Angela sent back a text that said, "Next case." Mara laughed, which was a short, quiet sound, and put her phone in her pocket. It was March by then. The Raleigh Street location's health permit had not been reinstated, and the lease, according to a brief item in the city's business news section, had been terminated by the property owner for non-payment, which was the operational consequence of running an indefinitely suspended food establishment for 4 months without finding a path to reopening. The building was available for new tenancy. She had seen the sign on her way to a client visit, the bright orange leasing notice in the front window where her lamp used to be. She had walked past without stopping. The DA's inquiry was ongoing and would proceed or not proceed according to its own timeline and the evidence it had. She had provided what she could provide. The rest was institutional. Her mother had not called again since the November phone call. Vivian had sent one email in January, a long, unstructured message that Mara had read once and replied to with 3 sentences. I'm aware of the situation. Angela Park handles all communications related to the legal matter. I wish you well. Vivian had not responded. She was sitting in the coffee shop near Garfield Street on a Thursday afternoon in mid-March, working on the Q2 client projection for Meridian, when Marcus sent her a message about a potential new client, a small food hall operator looking for a compliance audit across 6 vendor stalls, which was the kind of engagement that would be well suited for Petra's specific skill set and would let Marcus take on a solo hotel property audit that they had been discussing. She replied with a yes and a note about the division of the engagement, and then went back to the projections. The numbers in the projection were real. They came from actual invoiced amounts and actual client retention data and actual pipeline conversations she had been having with new potential clients, not assumptions about what she hoped would happen, but documented evidence of what was happening. The business had grown from a legal pad and a column of institutional memory into a functioning professional firm with 3 employees and a growing client base and a proprietary audit tool and a reputation in the city's food service community that was building with the same slow, reliable compounding that real reputations build with, which is through consistent work and accurate results. She thought about what she had written in that 3rd column 8 months ago. The words institutional memory, boxed and circled, sitting on a legal pad in an apartment above a restaurant she no longer owned. She had been right about what the column meant. The knowledge was the asset. The knowledge had survived everything that had happened to the building and the people and the documents and the money. It had survived because it was not located in any of those things. It was located in her. Her phone buzzed. Angela. She looked at the message. A single line. D. A office called. Moving to formal investigation. Thought you should know. She read it twice. Set the phone down. Picked up her coffee. The coffee was the good kind, the kind this particular shop made consistently, which was why she came here most evenings and some afternoons. Because she valued consistency in the things she chose to rely on. A hot cup at the right temperature, a table near the back where no one tried to make conversation, enough ambient noise to make the work feel inhabited rather than isolated. She opened the Q2 projection and scrolled to the new client pipeline section and added the food hall engagement. Typing the estimated contract value from memory, the number precise because she had already done the informal calculation in her head during the 2 minutes since Marcus's message, because that was how she worked and how she had always worked, with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned not to defer the calculation. She did not look up from her laptop. She had a 4 o'clock with a new client inquiry, a dim sum restaurant in the Eastbrook neighborhood whose owner had found her through a referral and whose inspection history showed a pattern that she could already see from the public records would require a full systems overhaul rather than a targeted corrective action. She had blocked 2 hours for the initial consultation, which was longer than her standard intake, because the work of correctly understanding a problem was never wasted time. She finished the projection entry, saved the file, and closed the laptop. Outside the coffee shop window, March was doing what March does, sitting in the indeterminate space between winter and something else, the air carrying the slight loosening that means the cold is losing its grip. Not warm yet, just less determined to stay. She put on her coat and picked up her bag and walked out,